Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Free Thought Forum. I'll be your host tonight, Jacob. Doug is not with us tonight, unfortunately. We have a bit to talk about tonight. Tonight I'll be just discussing a little bit, mostly be discussing the shooting in Orlando, Florida at the Pulse Nightclub, which is still on the minds of many as we're still finding out more about it. I'll be discussing a lot of different issues with what happened there. And this, of course, this is the worst mass shooting in U.S. history. 50 people died, including the shooter, and over 50 more were wounded. And since then, of course, a lot of people have been talking about what happened, what went wrong, and I think part of the problem is that a lot of people want to boil it down to just one thing and just offer one solution. But I think there's a lot of things we need to talk about as far as what factored into the shooting. So I'll be going over those, and I want to make it clear that, again, I don't think it's any one of these things, and and I'm not bringing up all these things to try to downplay any of them. I'm trying to bring attention to all the different issues in order to give a fuller picture of what we need to address moving forward, or at least what I think we need to address moving forward. And I think the first thing I want to talk about whenever there's a mass shooting, unfortunately, one of the things that's often lost very quickly are the victims. We go into debates about gun control, mental illness, etc., but sometimes we can quickly forget about who the victims were. And in this case, the shooting happened at a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, and the victims here is really the LGBT community, and I think it's important to remember that, because there's been a lot of violence against the LGBT community throughout U.S. history. This is certainly the largest single event of it. It's certainly nothing new, unfortunately. Last year alone, there were roughly 1,300 hate crimes reported in the U.S., including 20 homicides. Now, those rates have been in decline over the last few years, which is encouraging news. But there's still a lot of anti-gay violence is prevalent throughout the country, and some of that is just the lingering attitude towards the LGBT community that's endured for so long. I mean, it was in this country, it was considered a mental illness until around the 1980s, and it was really thanks to a lot of aggressive lobbying by the LGBT community that finally, at least the medical profession finally came around to that there was nothing wrong with being a member of the LGBT community. And actually, the World Health Organization didn't stop classifying it as some sort of disorder until the early 90s. So that's how recent we're talking here as far as how people have regarded the LGBT community. So a lot of that still seems to be lingering around, and again, while it's improving, there's still a long way to go. And there are many lesbian or gay people who have been talking about how this really felt like a violation of one of their sanctuaries, because many of these gay nightclubs feel like sanctuaries to the LGBT community. This is where they can go to just be open and themselves without having to deal with the dirty looks, the harassment, or even threats of violence that often accompanies being openly gay. And so to see this happen to a place that they really need to go to be themselves is, to them, is very deeply disturbing. And I think myself as a straight person, it can be difficult to imagine what it's like to even need a place like this. But there's, I can definitely sympathize with how they need, a place to just be themselves. And over the last weekend, we did a tabling event at the Lancaster Pride Festival, and there the police force was definitely was very heavy there to protect against perhaps somebody wanting to be a copycat. And it was actually probably one of the largest police presences I've ever seen at an event we've done. So that kind of should give an idea of how the mentality of just trying to be safe has been affected. So I think it's important to remember that. It's important to remember that, we as we discuss this issue, I think part of the issue needs to be a support of the LGBT community and a support of what they're trying of pushing for further acceptance and continuing to fight and trying to fight the prejudice that possibly led to this shooting. So we can continue to reduce the number of hate crimes that continue to be prevalent throughout this country, and that's why the LGBT community does have special protection under the law as far as with the Hate Crime Act, because they are so often targeted for no other reason than just being gay or lesbian or bisexual. And that's why I think we need to continue to fight the prejudice against that community. And unfortunately, the largest source of prejudice towards that community has been and will probably continue to be religion. Pretty much all of the Abrahamic religions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, at least among their fundamentalists, are very there's a lot of anti-gay sentiment, and I want to make it clear I'm talking about the more fundamentalists. I mean, you have the radical Muslims who are out there conducting violence against gay people, or you have the Westboro Baptist Church spewing the hatred that they do. There are also the Muslims and the Christians fighting that. So I think it's important to remember that, and because I think that there's nothing good can come out of just broad brushing any religious group, because there's such a diversity of opinions within it. But I think it's still important to address the religious motivations behind attacks like these, behind the hate crimes, because one thing the shooter did when I think it was after the shooting started, he called 911 and actually pledged his support to some radical Muslim terrorist groups, such as ISIS and a couple of others, which are actually groups that are at war with each other. So I think what we can draw from that is he probably didn't have any strong ties to any of those groups personally. Probably didn't even really know much about them other than their names and what they do, and nothing really more than that. So I think we can conclude that he acted alone, but it's still that the example of those groups being there seems to have had an impact and an influence on him, which is why I think we need to continue to fight against that and gain allies against the radical Muslim groups wherever we can, even especially among the more moderate Muslims. Just like whenever a couple of years ago I was at a marriage equality rally in Pennsylvania, and there was there was definitely a large Christian presence there, and I think it's important and it was really, that shows the importance of building allies wherever possible, where we set aside our personal opinions maybe on other issues, especially the question of God, at times to just be able to move forward and fight against the violence done in the name of, that people do, whatever the motivation for it. And again, I'm not trying to downplay the religious motivation. I'm more like, I'm trying to make sure we don't alienate potential allies in the process, because and it is unfortunate that religion has played such a large part in it, mainly because, you know, all the Abrahamic religions have the same creation story of, you know, Adam and Eve, one man, one woman, and that's just how it's supposed to be. And those who take it literally and those who think it's, you know, that's the only thing acceptable that can be acceptable are going to have a hard time, or view any other expression of sexuality as being an insult to their God, or at least among the fundamentalists. Again, it's important to make that distinction. And you know, many of these, you know, and as I said, many of these Islamic groups, as well as, you know, more extremists, have been, even since the shooting, have been essentially gloating over this and celebrating it, including, as you would imagine, the Westboro Baptist Church. The Texas Lieutenant Governor, the morning that it happened, tweeted essentially a Bible verse that's saying, "God will not be mocked and you reap what you sow," which is very disturbing coming from a high-ranking official. And I think that just goes to show the anti-gay culture that still exists in America, that you can be such a high-ranking official and still be capable of saying something like that. And I think one of the things that should also be mentioned here is there's been some reports, I'm not sure how much credibility I put in them, but it looks like the shooter himself may have been gay, or at least had some tendencies. And one thing we noticed throughout, you know, some of the anti-gay rhetoric that goes on is that it's sometimes coming from people who themselves are gay. The best example of that was Pastor Ted Haggard. And sometimes they get very, very opposed to it and violent about it because they can't accept themselves. And I think that's one thing that's important, that at least, especially for a lot of things throughout the world and a lot of problems, is it's really can sometimes come down to self-acceptance. And if we can build a better culture where it's more accepting towards the LGBT community, then people of that community can really start to accept themselves. So I mean, that's why I think we really do need to build a better community, and I think that's part of what the focus should. That's why I'm kind of keep pushing this issue, because that's really something that we try to do moving forward. And I'll probably return a little bit to that subject later. But another thing we often talk about during mass shootings is the issue of gun control. You know, we do have a very disproportionately high amount of gun violence in this country compared to other developed nations. And unfortunately, I think occasionally there's been a lot of misrepresentations on both sides of the gun control debate, unfortunately, which is why it's really hard to have a meaningful discussion sometimes. And recently there's been a few a few reports put out by some anti-gun people that have been so factually incorrect, so terrible that other gun control advocates have felt compelled to refute them, because there's nothing more. You can actually damage your position more by presenting garbage arguments for it than having to deal that can actually do more damage to your position than, say, a good argument against it, because it can really undermine the credibility of your own position. And I think it's important that people are calling out some of these misrepresentations. And on the other side, for the more pro-gun side, other people try to represent anybody who advocates for gun control as wanting to get rid of all guns. Now, that I will say there are people who do hold that position, but unfortunately they tend to represent everybody as that. And I think it's unfair to represent everybody in terms of the extremist of a position, because every position you can hold has its extremist. Just like you have people who want to get rid of all the guns, or you might have people who essentially want to arm everybody, which again doesn't sound I can't even imagine what that would be like. I personally don't like the idea that to feel safe you have to walk out of your house armed. That doesn't make me feel safe, actually. But again, I think it's important to do our best to represent the other side of a position correctly, so we can have a good, honest discussion about the issues, so we can actually find a more practical solution. Because unfortunately, the solutions offered thus far have been somewhat impractical, or while well-meaning, may not actually be able to do what they intend to do. For example, one of the legislations proposed was a terror watch list to restrict gun sales to people who might be suspected of terrorism. Now, the problem with this sounds way too much like the no-fly list, which was implemented post 9/11. It was supposed to prevent suspected terrorists from getting on planes, but unfortunately it was implemented so badly that it started restricting people who were in no way connected to any terrorist group from flying. And so especially when you're dealing with the possession of firearms, which is a constitutional right, we would essentially be denying a constitutional right without due process, which just wouldn't fly in the court system. So I can appreciate people who want to get a solution, want to improve the laws we have, but unfortunately, it's a little bit too some of the things that have been proposed are too reactionary. I think we need to be more thought out about how we approach the issue, because really the last time, one of the times we had a reactionary, not so thought out solution to a problem, we got the Patriot Act, which we had to deal with for a very long time. So I think that's why we really do need to have a good discussion about this, and really find out where we want to put how do we ensure that only the responsible people are in possession of firearms. And that might sound simple what we want to do, because I think a lot of people do favor responsible gun ownership, but the question of how we do it is a very complicated one. Whenever you get into the nuts and bolts of trying to write law, it can be very, very difficult. kind of like, I kind of go back to the one court decision talking about, what's obscenity, and the best they could do is I know it when I see it. And it's one of those things where when you try to write something in law and define things, it can be very, very difficult, which is why I think trying to get sensible gun control in place is a lot more difficult than what people are making it out to be. Now, I realize there are some people who will just stonewall any sort of gun control that there is, and other people are proposing gun control that's probably not going to help anything anyway, or is potentially unconstitutional. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, I think, as we move forward in the discussion. And another thing that always gets brought up when we have a mass shooting is mental illness. And it is true that I think some of these shooters have suffered from some sort of mental illness, but I think it's also a problem that we only seem to be talking about it after mass shootings, because that only reinforces the stigma that mental illness is inherently will automatically lead to violence, which isn't the case. There's very few mental illnesses that are actually make you more prone to violence, and really this is. I should say that this is. It almost seems like just paying lip service to it as well, because almost nothing is done. Nothing is ever done about it. And as John Oliver put it, all we've ever done so far is nothing in prison. So we really do need to address mental health as well, not just in the case of mass shootings either. I mean, there's a lot of people who do suffer from some sort of mental health condition, whether it may or may not make them violent, but it still might put them at risk for personal harm. And again, that's another issue where, how do we do that? It's a difficult problem, but I think we can do better than what we're doing now. And I think that's in general what we can do, what we can talk about moving forward is how do we do better than what we're doing now? We've made some improvements. I mean, violent crime rates are going down. There's, the hate crimes have been going down. There have been the religiously inspired violence, at least in some segments, has been going down, or at least, at the very least, the objection to it is becoming more and more outspoken. There have been more religious groups who have been working to more vocal and more visible, fighting against the more extremists in their faction. But I think it's, we still have a long way to go, and I think that's one of the things that kind of hit me as I was looking at the shooting and trying to think about how I felt about it, was I didn't want to go through the same old discussion. It feels like, as President Obama said, with how many mass shootings we've been having, it's starting to feel routine. It's feeling all too routine, where I almost don't want to even jump on Facebook the days after it, because I'm like, I could just name somebody on my Facebook and I know what they're going to post, because it's the same thing every time. And I think we can do better than that. I think we can come at this discussion in a better way, in a where we can have more fruitful discussions. I think there are a lot of people who have been doing that lately, and because I've seen a few more people talking about this, where they do want to talk about all the different issues involved, and not try to boil it down to one, not try to minimize any of them, but just try to acknowledge that we're dealing with a lot of different things here. And I think and I think we that's the kind of we need not to be dismissive, and again, there's just better ways to do this. But I think one of the things is there's been a little bit more focus on the positives that have come out of this. For example, the next day after the shooting, there were people lined up around the block at blood banks to donate blood to help the victims or help replenish the supplies of local hospitals who are treating the wounded. And this kind of reminds me of what happened after the Paris attacks, where people just started responding to it. There was no call to do this. It was just people lining up to do it. This is, people wanting to help out. There was a GoFundMe page set up by Equality Florida that, last I checked, is over $6 million to help the victims. And I think even GoFundMe itself has donated $100,000 to it. And I would imagine they're probably going to waive their typical 5% fee. Or at least I hope they will. And there's been denouncements by various religious groups, denouncing this kind of religious violence, religiously inspired violence. It's both Christian and Muslim alike. In fact, the Utah Lieutenant Governor, in a talk about it, started out by apologizing for the way he's treated the LGBT community in the past. And I think that's the thing, is minds do change. People do change, and I think the attitude towards the LGBT community has been changing dramatically over the last 20 years. We still have a ways to go, but I think if you look at just the polling in as to whether or not people favored same-sex marriage in from between the early 90s and today, it's been a dramatic shift. And this week, even the Pope called for an apology towards the LGBT community, as well as other marginalized marginalized groups. Now, I'll admit I'm a little cynical about that. The Pope has said things like that before, and who's the cardinal that keeps coming out and says, no, we don't really mean that? In the past, I'll admit, I'm sorry, I'm just a little cynical about this Pope. It kind of reminds me of something Keith Lowell Jensen said at the Reason rally, where he talked about Jack in the Box, how they got rid of their mascot, and then when I think a salmonella outbreak killed a bunch of people, they brought it back, and essentially people forgave them for bringing back this fun mascot. And then he said, which brings me to the new Pope. But I've gone off on a tangent. I appreciate him doing it. It's still good that even if he's just superficially putting on a good show, at least if it changes a couple of minds about the LGBT community, it's worth it. And I think that's one of the things where it's easy to lose patience when you're working towards social justice, where you know where you want to be, but it's such a long, torturous incremental process that it's easy to lose patience. And I think it's got to be worse when you're even part of that community. I'm not really part of any marginalized community, so I don't know what. Yes, atheism does get marginalized, but I mean, I feel like I'm kind of joining the atheist movement while we were making significant progress. If I would have joined maybe years before that, I would have felt much more marginalized. But I don't. At least I haven't I haven't felt any personal marginalization, I should say. I haven't faced any personal discrimination. While there's marginalization of atheists in other parts of the country where people personally do lose their jobs and do get essentially run out of town by people. I haven't personally faced that. So that's what I meant by that statement. Where, and it's just like I don't want to put myself in the same league as people who have gone through that sort of marginalization, and so I think it's hard for me to really understand the sort of frustrations they must be going through. But I think the best we can do is just the best we can do. How do we move forward from this? And the club itself intends to reopen, at least the report I saw about the owner has said that they do intend to reopen the club, which I think is a great thing. All too often when an instance like this happen, people tend to just want to shut the place down and essentially abandon it. But I think the better thing is to just try to move on. I think it helps us. I think it helps us deal with it. It makes it so this person, essentially, so the people like the shooter don't win. They don't. Their hatred doesn't stop us from doing what we want. From attending clubs like these. From just living our lives on a daily basis. And sometimes we can honor the victims best by being able to move on. Obviously, you don't want to forget them, and you want to continue to support the causes and do what we can to improve society. And we do need to move on, but I think hopefully we can get a better, clear direction of how we move on. And I think we're off to a pretty good start with. And I've noticed a lot more emphasis on positive aspects, the positive responses after terrible incidences like this, because I think people do want to be, it's easy to drown in your own pessimism, and I think more and more people want to be a bit more positive and find ways to cope, and I think John Oliver put it best when he said, when you look at the response to tragedies like this, you realize this guy's, a terrible person, but the terrible person is outnumbered. For every one person wanting to do this, who committed a horrible act, there's millions of people ready to help out and lend a hand in helping people recover, and I think we see that more and more, and that was actually the subject of probably one of my favorite speeches by Seth Andrews on his YouTube channel, The Thinking Atheist. If you ever see it, it's the title of the talk is called "The Good Old Days," where he's talking about how people get really, really down about what's going on in the world today. But if you turn your perspective a little bit and focus on the positives, like you see, somebody doing something horrible, but then you also always see people rushing in to help. When he was talking about in Texas there was a shooting where a lot of people risked their lives getting other people out of harm's way. So again, for every one person who's doing that, there's other people stepping up to help the situation. And I mean, I think I do feel optimistic. We can continue to reduce violence against the LGBT community. The more people the more people who are out and open and encouraged to come out, the less prejudice there has been against the LGBT community, which I think has helped encourage more people to be open about their sexuality, and which hopefully continues to get the ball rolling. We can continue to build relationships with more progressive religious groups, and I think that's important to do. I mean, I know there are some who would just rather get rid of religion altogether, but that's not a practical. I don't see that as being a practical viewpoint, because it's not going to happen anytime soon. I'm not even sure if, there's debate over whether or not we want that to happen. So, and I've always been one for the quickest way to fix the system, to fix things, is to work within the system you have. I realize that people are not going to be like me for saying that, because a lot of people want to chuck whatever systems you had and start all over. But unfortunately, a lot of times we do have to deal with the system we have in front of us and see what progress we can make with what we have. And I think the best way to do that right now is to work with the more progressive religious groups in denouncing religious violence, or in denouncing religiously inspired bigotry. Because, and I think it's important not to single, and on that note, I think it's important not to single out any one religious group as far as, saying they're the problems, because I've seen it coming from all different religious groups. And I'm not trying to downplay what any one religious group is saying, but I'm just saying let's not single them out. I remember a rather disturbing conversation I was in, where an old family friend was talking about what happens to gay people in Muslim nations under Sharia law, and he was talking about it with envy, like that's what he wanted to do. And it was just horrifying to hear a man who, for the most part, is a decent person, just say something so hateful. And I think it's, hopefully we can work to remedy that in both Christianity, Islam, and any other groups. And that's not to say that atheists don't have their anti-gay bigots either. And I think that's one thing we need to recognize, is we're not, we sometimes get a little, we definitely get full of ourselves from time to time, but we're not immune from, we're definitely not immune from the sorts of bigotry that often show up in religion. And I think we can do better on gun control. And I think one of the some things some people will say is, don't we have enough laws on the books? But unfortunately, many of these laws have a lot of loopholes in them that need to be closed. And that's actually one of the executive actions by the president recently, was to attempt to close loopholes, because things like background checks were not universal, and there were online gun sales that were not policed. There's gun trafficking going on throughout the country, and I think that's one of the things that I personally think we need to do is have more nationwide gun laws. I should say standardize the gun laws nationwide, because if you're going to having locally stricter gun laws isn't going to help much when people can just bring them in from out of state, where they can go places where the gun laws are more relaxed, and then bring them into more restricted areas and sell them. And that goes on quite a bit in this country, and that's one of the things that the executive action was trying to cut down on, is really go after gun trafficking. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's a start, and I think it's one of those ways we can look. And as I was saying earlier, it can be difficult to craft laws because you have to be able to make the restrictions you want without restricting people you don't mean to. But if you make the restrictions too loose, then you start to get all sorts of loopholes. It's a difficult process, which is why we need good, honest discussions about it. And actually, again, and with mental illness, I think it's another thing that I've seen a few people start to be more open about their mental illnesses as well, to get people to understand what it means to be mentally ill and try to get rid of the stigmas, but still make sure people can get the help they need. And that's part. I mean, getting rid of the stigmas is definitely one of the things. First steps in getting people to open up about their mental illness, in order to help improve the treatment process. I know in the atheist movement, J.T. Eberhard has been doing a bit for terms of trying to reduce the stigma around mental illness, so that so that people who do have mental illnesses can get the help they need. and again, I think we do need some optimism and some encouragement moving forward. Make sure those who are out there doing good get supported. And the atheist community is often fond of saying, like, don't thank a deity, thank a doctor. And that's, I can only imagine what the first response staff has to go through in order when they have to respond to a situation like this. I mean, I can't even imagine what they're going through. I mean, I know people who have first responders do often have to deal with a lot of mental trauma from what they have to witness, and I think they need to be supported, because they're the people who are going to help you if this sort of thing ever happens to you. And I think it is important to stay optimistic about the progression of society. I mean, I think sometimes as some people have said, sometimes it's not the world getting worse, it's more like we're getting more sensitive to it. We're having less tolerance for actions like this, and that's a good thing. That's good that we don't that we just don't tolerate this anymore. There's a lot of people who have just had enough, and I think it's important to focus that, though. We get angry at things, and people just want to start yelling about what they think went wrong and why aren't we fixing it. But I think it's important to focus our efforts into how do we get to where we need to be. And I've seen a couple of people discuss that, whereas I think let's stop making these the discussion following a tragedy like this can feel routine. I think we need to break that routine to actually make some progress forward. But I think that's about all I have to say on the subject. I know there's probably people out there who could do a much more exhaustive discussion, but part of it is we still have facts trickling in, and more details emerging about the shooter, trying to, as we try to piece together what all led to this tragedy. So I think that there may be some things that a detail emerging might prove me wrong on, and we'll try to keep up to date on that. And that's why I think it's important not to have a knee-jerk reaction to some of these events, because sometimes it can take a while to piece together what actually happened. But I think these are just some ideas how to move forward. But I think I'll just round out the show by talking a little bit, going back a little bit to the Reason Rally, because I didn't make it. Unfortunately, I wasn't at the show last time because I wasn't feeling well. But I definitely, I also went down to the Reason Rally, got pretty badly sunburned for it. But it was probably it was definitely a really fun time. I spent a lot of time just walking around, seeing who else was there. It was meant to be the community the atheist community coming together for for to kind of just to be together, and that's why it was fun to meet some prominent members of the community who weren't even speakers there. And actually I got to meet Hemet Mehta. Seth Andrews was there, although neither of them was speaking. I did get to shake the hand of Lawrence Krauss. That was fun. I really he's the physicist, I think particle physicist. I've read a couple of his books. The one went way over my head, but it was still fun to meet him. And one thing that was fun is I have a T-shirt that says Pluto, never forget. Kind of making fun of the downgrade of Pluto from planet to dwarf planet. And I actually had about a dozen people stop me to take a picture of it. But I think one of my favorite moments of the Reason Rally personally was when Penn Jillette was on stage. She brought up a young woman from Ecuador's Got Talent.
I have a 4-minute clip of that if you want to play it.
Did you play that last time?
Yes.
Don't worry about it. Sorry, but there was the young woman. I think there was a clip of it from last time, but where they brought a young woman up from Ecuador's Got Talent, who the judges were yelling at her for being an atheist, and she was just very unapologetic about it and defending herself. And it was just fun to watch her come up on stage, and she was a little overwhelmed at how positive the response was. A lot of people love John Delancey's talk, where he was essentially acting like God. He really played it up and really played his Q. He played Q from Star Trek. So, and I noticed someone from our organization said the character of Q really helped him see God in a different perspective. Like how would an all-powerful being who actually had emotions really act? And I think he was talking about how the character of Q helped him see that. But I mean, it was good to see him. Like you could tell he really put a lot of effort into his presentation. It was also fun to see a talk by Bill Nye, the science guy. He, a personal childhood hero of mine. I watched his show growing up. And I really liked how he was talking about some of the crisis we face as far as climate change, but what he left with. I think what he was leaving people with was we can still do something about this, and that's what I appreciate. He was trying to encourage people to get involved in science, so that maybe they can find the solutions to climate change. They can maybe make more practical renewable energy. And I think it was good to see how it's one thing just to state what the problem is, but but I think he did the right thing, just trying to encourage people to find the solution. And I think that's important in any cause you're in, is to not just stand there complaining about what the problem is. And if you don't have the solution, see what you can do to seek one out, or inspire other people to look into the problem and find the solution. because we're not always, no one's going to have the answers to every problem. But as long as we're helpful and encouraging to others, maybe we can find a solution. Excuse me. But it was also kind of fun just walking around the Washington Mall. It's been, I think, about 25 years since I've been to Washington, D.C. I was kind of too young to remember anything the first time I was there. But it's obviously one of those places you often see in movies and pictures and videos, but it's just a little bit, there's just something different about being there, like walking up the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, looking out at the Washington Monument, at the different memorials around, and it's, I definitely had a great time. It was nice really nice to get out and meet people, and there was a lot of good talks there as well. Most of them talking about a lot of different aspects of the atheist movement, and I think the atheist movement definitely has a lot of different things we're focusing on, where it's not just challenging religion, but it's also fighting for women's rights, which are, religion has done a lot to fight against women's rights and LGBT rights and religiously inspired violence. It's all these different things that we tend to focus on, and some people criticize it for lacking focus. I think it gives everybody a chance to find what they're most passionate about. And I think it's when you get involved in activism, it's important to go with where your passions are, because not everybody's going to be interested in every issue. There's people interested in issues that I'm not. I'm interested in different issues that other people don't really care about. And I think a lot of that depends upon really your own background growing up. I've often, I know I've said this before, and I'll have to say it again. I think there's some legitimacy to the joke: are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist? Because the ex-Catholics in our organization will definitely have a lot to say when you start getting them on the subject of the Catholic Church. Or if you get me on to more fundamentalist Protestant Christianity and homeschooling and creationism, that's where I'll get a little worked up. Another example is Rebecca Vitzman, who her home was destroyed by a tornado a couple years ago, and she was the one who was outed on national television by Wolf Blitzer, who asked if she thanked the Lord for surviving when they were standing in the rubble of her old neighborhood. But it actually wasn't that inspired her. It was actually a week later, they were going through what was left of her house to kind of gather the last remaining belongings and get out of there. And the person who was sent there to help her kept trying to say, saying religious things to her and essentially assuming she was a Christian and just generally kind of being annoying to her because she's an atheist and she doesn't want to get into this argument right now. So she's taken that as an inspiration to, and now she works for Foundation Beyond Belief, helping them set up a disaster relief program. So it's like what we've experienced will affect what we want to do, and that's why I think it's important to keep all these things in mind. And kind of going back with the Orlando shooting, maybe I'm being a little unfair criticizing people for focusing maybe only on one issue of the shooting, because some different people are going to have different things that mean more to them. And that's, although I think it's important to acknowledge all the rest of the issues, both in both cases, and in the atheist community. I personally, even if it's a cause that I don't really get involved in, I still encourage people to pursue what their passions are, and essentially however you want to make the world a better place is up to you. And I'm not, as long as you do, great, go for it, because it's people will often argue, well, don't we have anything more important to do? There's always something more important to do. If we focused on, if we tried to only focus on the most important things, we'd never get anything done. That's the unfortunate reality of it. But I think whatever little change we can make for the better is always welcome, which is why I'm out doing what I do. It's not necessarily, I realize I may just be a little ripple in a pond and not personally do anything, but not do much myself. But any little thing I can do, I feel like I should do it. I've sometimes said I wrote a letter to the editor in my county newspaper a couple years ago, and it was like just a little county newspaper, not anything major, but I had a lot of positive response from it, where I was defending evolution, atheism from some other letter that was criticizing Bill Nye, and it was on the heels of the Nye-Ham debate. And I wrote a response to it, and a lot of people had a positive response to it. And I even had one person tell me that after they read the letter, they didn't know what they believed anymore. So it's and again, it's I think it's about sometimes having realistic goals. We want to, we all, again, like what I was saying earlier, we know where we want to be, but sometimes we have to be happy about how far we've come, but still work towards getting better. I think there's a fine balance between becoming complacent and setting too high a goals till the point we become pessimistic. It's difficult moving forward, but I think life gets messy, and we just have to deal with it. But we're coming to a close now. Hopefully we'll be back to full staff the next show, which will be again the second Tuesday in July. I hope you all have a happy 4th of July. I unfortunately will be working, although a nice 30-minute break to watch fireworks that my boss doesn't know about. Anyway, yeah, don't worry, he doesn't watch this show. But yeah, it's excuse me. So thanks for tuning in. Hopefully we'll see you next time. And again, okay. How much time we have left? Sorry.
7 seconds.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Yeah.